What causes war? Once wars begin, how do they end? How can some knowledge about the causes of war help us bring an end to wars, especially if they threaten to become long wars? These are urgent questions today with the war in Ukraine. The news of a recent Rand Corporation report on avoiding a long war in Ukraine shows these questions are now being asked in Washington, D.C., hopefully not too late. Can we combine a little bit of news and a little bit of history to find a recipe for peace? How can a history of the causes of war bring peace to Ukraine and the world? That is the question on today's Burning Archive. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I am Geoffrey, and I tell stories about the history of the multipolar world and how it is playing out in geopolitics and in culture. And this video will give you a good idea of what I'm trying to do here, and do stick around to the end and I'll give you some recommendations for some other videos of mine that you can watch. And today's topic is one of the classics in history and I guess in geopolitics. What causes war? What causes peace? I guess it's also a classic in world literature. It's the theme of the Mahabharata. It's the theme of Tolstoy's War and Peace. It's the theme of some of the great novels of the 20th century, like Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. And one of the big pieces of geopolitical news over the last 2 weeks has been the release of a report by the Rand Corporation in the United States of America titled How to Avoid a Long War, with the subtitle US Policy and the Trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. This report, I did a kind of a live stream on this report a couple of weeks ago, which goes into more detail. And I'm not going to get into the detail of the report today, but it has been interpreted by some people as a bit of an admission by at least some in the military political establishment in America that Ukraine might be losing the war, even that America might have stumbled inadvertently into a long war. It cannot win another endless war. And it explores various options for finding some sort of peace settlement or armistice or ceasefire, or even potentially escalation in Ukraine. And there's clearly a debate going on in the US administration about what the right policy should be. But that's a discussion for another day. What I want to explore today is one of the surprises of the report for me, because a very fine history book makes an appearance in the Rand Corporation report. It's a fine history book by a great historian from Australia, indeed from Melbourne, where I live, and indeed from one of my old teachers at the University of Melbourne, Geoffrey Blainey. Geoffrey Blainey, Causes of War, provides some of the conceptual underpinnings of the Rand Corporation's report on how to avoid a long war. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that book, how it fits into the broader literature on causes of war, and how that is sort of playing out in the discussion of the Ukraine conflict today. Geoffrey Blainey is arguably one of Australia's greatest historians, and the fact that he is influencing, I guess, the international policy debate on the fate of Ukraine. What is it, like 50 years after he wrote his book, The Causes of War, is perhaps tribute to that. And as I said, Geoffrey Blainey actually taught me history at the University of Melbourne, taught me European history, no less. Less than 10 years after he wrote that book. And I have here the sort of signed copy of, ironically enough, Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, that was amongst a number of books I got as a prize in European history way back in the early 1980s. So I do feel a degree of a personal connection to Geoffrey Blainey, and it's partly that inspired me to do this video. But Geoffrey Blainey's Causes of War is a very celebrated text in the whole literature of the history of war, and obviously people have been trying to understand what causes war since perhaps wars began. But Geoffrey Blainey's book, The Causes of War, from originally published I think in 1973, and has since gone through it was updated with a couple of fresh editions, kind of analyses all international wars from 1700 up until the 20th century, and proposes some different ideas about why some wars are long, why some wars are short, and why wars break out, or in some cases peace breaks out. And perhaps one of the innovative ideas in his book is that it is perhaps the phenomenon that needs more explanation amongst the rather conflict-ridden human societies is, why does peace break out rather than war break out? And he proposed the idea that the war and peace are alternating phases of a relationship between rival nations. And this was very much a response to debates around blaming, I guess, one side or another for war. Throughout the 20th century, with World War I and World War II, a huge amount of historical debate was based around, well, who was to blame for those two wars? Perhaps less so in the case of World War II, but certainly with World War I, who was to blame? Was it Germany? Was it Britain? Was it Russia? Was it somebody else? The sort of debate around war guilt was particularly important in the 1960s in Germany, and there was an enormous debate around acknowledging, there was an important self-reflection for acknowledging the guilt of World War II in Germany, but that also played out into going back to World War I, and there was a huge historiographical debate over some historians' work that looked at who was to blame, or Germany accepting its guilt for being the main initiator of World War I in those arguments. And the literature on that is enormous. I'm not going to get into that today. But Geoffrey Blainey's book, The Causes of War, was kind of an intervention into that whole debate, where he really said, well, let's kind of take the blame out of it and let's look at the actual facts, remembering he was an economic historian, and what is the kind of more statistical or sociological explanation of things. And that's where he says you've got to look at war and peace as different phases of relationships between rival nations. There's no point just pointing the finger and saying he did it. You got to sort of look at the dynamic between those two relationships. And similarly, if we remember the context in which Geoffrey Blainey, or if we think back to the context in which Geoffrey Blainey was writing his book, it's the early 1970s. The Vietnam War is going on, and there's an enormous set of demonstrations for an anti-war movement within Western societies. And to some degree, there's a sort of self-recrimination within those societies about who was to blame for the war. And in this context, Geoffrey Blainey is saying, let's stop talking about war guilt. Let's see this as a manifestation of conflicted relationships between different parties, I guess the Soviet bloc and the American bloc in that case. So again, he argued war and peace are alternating phases of a relationship in which rival nations must be seen as pairs, and he explored why some wars are long and some wars are short, and what it is that leads to the outbreak of war, and similarly the outbreak of peace that leads warring parties to say, I'm better off negotiating a peace agreement now rather than continuing this war. And his theory essentially was the idea that war and peace break out because of the perceptions of the parties, the warring parties, the warring countries, about their relative military power. His hypothesis is that when two sides disagree on their relative strength, when Germany thinks it is much more powerful than Britain and the Allied powers, or France, but France does not think so, then war is likely to break out. But when they agree on their relative strength, when Germany accepts that there's no way they don't have sufficient military power to defeat the Allied powers, then peace breaks out. So it's this sort of almost like a game theory of war. If people feel that they can press an advantage and there's a mismatch in perceptions of relative strength, then war is likely to break out, a kind of prisoner's dilemma, if you like. Whereas peace is more likely to break out if there can be more realistic assessments of just how scary is that neighbour that we are having our dispute with. So that's basically Geoffrey Blainey's idea, and that is the idea that's included in the Rand Corporation report. Now, it has been an enormously influential book. I've heard the prominent American historian Victor Davis Hanson from the Hoover Institution frequently pay tribute to Geoffrey Blainey's Causes of War, and I think it's widely taught within kind of military colleges and whatnot in America. So it is absolutely seen as a classic in the literature on the causes of war. A bit of a source of pride for Australian history, I guess. But of course, the literature on the causes of war is absolutely enormous. Just the literature on the causes of the First World War is enormous. But then, if you think about how many wars there have been over the course of human history, wow. I mean, I think there was a report done recently about America only having half a dozen, maybe, years in its existence, the United States of America, where it has not been at war. So there's a lot of data out there on the causes of war, and obviously an enormous debate over different approaches. But Blaney's idea has been particularly important because he sort of gets away from the moral arguments of, is this a just war? Is this a justified war? Or who is to blame for the war? And perhaps he keys more into the kind of considerations that pragmatic statespeople and soldiers might need to study through military history, given the situation we're in. What the hell are we going to do now? But of course, there are many different explanations of causes of war. Some go to human nature and whether it's prone to conflict, and where some are much more sociological, cultural, institutional. What are the sort of factors? And in a way, I guess Geoffrey Blainey's one is more in that realm, and after all, it helps people. That kind of explanation potentially provides a little bit more advice to people today as to what the hell they should do once they're in a war. But everyone needs to understand, of course, there's limitations to these ideas and benefits to these ideas, but nonetheless, it is a powerful idea that perhaps can explain things. And Geoffrey Blainey's book is beautifully written. Some of the literature on war that adopts his ideas turns much more into kind of game theory and talking about bargaining failures and information asymmetries and all that sort of thing, without some of the elegance and plain language of Geoffrey Blainey's original text. But the basic idea is still very prominent, particularly in American policy circles. In the Rand Corporation report, there is a discussion about the impediments to ending the conflict, one of which is mutual optimism about the course of the war. So, if Ukraine thinks it's winning, and if Russia thinks it's winning, why would they end it? Whereas if both of them think, oh God, we're getting a bit stuck in a stalemate here, or we're losing and destroying ourselves, they're more likely to sue for peace. And the Rand report essentially summarises Geoffrey Blainey's idea. So it says here, international relations scholarship has found that wars become protracted when the belligerents disagree about their prospects for victory. In peacetime, states cannot be sure about an adversary's military capabilities or willingness to fight, and therefore its ability to win on the battlefield. Moreover, states have an incentive to exaggerate their power and resolve so as to get what they want without having to go to war. Some scholars think of wars as resolving this information problem. That's the sort of game theory sort of idea. Since fighting reveals the true balance of power and interests, once that information is clear to both sides, the weaker or less determined of the two should become more pessimistic about what it can gain by continuing to fight. This pessimism should cause that side to adjust its demands downward, potentially opening space for an agreement to end the war. Dealing with excess optimism about the course of the war is, to some degree, a solution for peace. Amidst all the flag waving and the confidence and the determination to support one side or another, people can perhaps not look at the realities of how the war is going, and optimism, while it might inspire hope in the population and resolve amongst leaders, can also lead to decisions that lengthen war. And so this is where this RAND Corporation is quite important, because a very significant part of the American elite is really saying, well, perhaps Ukraine, perhaps Russia, perhaps even the United States has overestimated its confidence and optimism about the course of the war. The RAND Corporation report rates the chances of Ukraine achieving its war aims as extremely unlikely. And it refers to the difference in capabilities of Russia versus Ukraine in terms of military capabilities, as well as referring to the very extensive costs and harms to Western countries in both Europe, but especially also in the United States, of a long and protracted war. And it even almost seems to concede at points that that long war has already the war has already perhaps become something of a long war. Essentially, the RAND Corporation report is subtly saying to American leaders, perhaps we should stop pumping up this war. Perhaps we should be a little bit more pessimistic about it, because that is actually the pathway to peace. And this also relates to another idea in the literature on the causes of war, which is called dispute inflation, where different sides get themselves into a more intense conflict by changing their beliefs about what is at stake in the war. Do we believe that what is at stake in the war is which of those countries, Russia and Ukraine, controls the provinces of Donbass and Novorossiya? Or do we believe that the fate of Western civilization hinges on this war? And if we believe the latter, then perhaps we're likely to intensify our sense of what's at stake in the war, maybe rightly, but also perhaps maybe wrongly, and lead not to peace, but to more intense and difficult conflict. Perhaps we also need to apply the same kind of prudence and pessimism around the growing conflict between the United States and China. Does either side really have an accurate assessment of how well such a war between those two parties would go for either themselves or the rest of the world? Certainly for poor old Australia down here in the Southern Ocean. So, inflating optimism about the success of the war and deflating assessments of the costs of the war is a dangerous strategy. It's an understandable human strategy when conflict emerges to believe that your side is winning, but it can prolong rather than shorten wars, and grandiose ideas about what is at stake in wars, making a war not just over narrow interests but over grand civilizational values can also lead to dispute inflation and intensification of the conflict. We really need a bit of deflation of the balloon. Perhaps let's deflate the balloon of war rhetoric in Ukraine rather than shoot down a balloon over America. A little less outrage, a little less flag waving, a little more scrupulous pessimism about the course of the war and the causes and consequences of war might just promote peace and restore us to the pathway of dialogue and diplomacy. And I'm so pleased that my old teacher, Geoffrey Blainey, should be showing the way to leaders around the world, especially in America, that a little bit of study of history and a little bit of modesty about how our side is actually going can promote the cause of peace. If you like this video, you might also like to check some of my summaries and reviews of some of the best history books on geopolitics. I've got a playlist of those which I'll just add to the thing wherever it is on the channel, and I will see you in my next video.
What thou lovest well shall not be reft from thee.